You wrote this book and called it Originals. What did you mean by an original? How do you define that?
I think about originals as people who don't just question the way we've always done it, but actually take the initiative to create a better way. So it's not just about having a new idea. It's about taking action to create change. And I think that's so important because I think it's often said that that ideation without execution is just hallucination. There's so many people who dream up interesting ideas but never do anything about them. And actually, I'll give you a personal example. When I was in university, I had a roommate. This is 2000. Who had an idea for a social network. And he said, what if we could build like an online yearbook where everybody had access to each other's profiles and they could communicate and they could plan parties. And he stayed up all night coding it and actually building the basics of the platform. And then he never followed through and never did anything with it. And then a few years later, Mark Zuckerberg starts Facebook in the house next door. And I could look at that and say, my roommate was an idiot. Like, why didn't he do anything about it? But guess what? I missed that same opportunity. 1999, I co-founded what was called the first online social network on our campus. And it was an e-group we had connected about an eighth of our entering college freshman class before we got to campus. And we were all exchanging messages and connecting. And then we got to campus and we shut it down. Because we said we all live in the same town now. Why do we need an online community? And so I made the same mistake. I was part of a group of people that had a very original idea, and we did not execute it.
So the difference is execution there.
I think it's the biggest difference.
And what does it take for someone to be an executioner?
I hope no one becomes an executioner, but maybe an executor would work. I think that it's not what I thought. I think I assumed that you had to be somebody who was always the first mover. That, if you didn't act on the social network idea in those first few years, it was going to be too late. But as I think you know this already, Stephen, but I was surprised to find that some of the best originals are actually procrastinators. That they don't rush in. They wait for their best idea as opposed to just immediately implementing their first idea. And of course, they're testing and iterating and experimenting along the way. But let's go back to my Nintendo days here. I've felt like I'm not an original thinker for a long time. And one day I had a PhD student, Jihei Shin, who came to my office and said, I actually think that procrastinating can make you more creative. And Jihei is incredibly creative, and I didn't believe her. I was like, no, this can't be true. And she said, really, I have my most creative ideas when I'm procrastinating. And I didn't believe it because I guess I've always been what psychologists call a precrastinator, which is somebody who the moment you have an idea, you want to immediately put it into practice. And so I was always excited to get things done early, and I was proud of being a good finisher. And Jihei said, I actually think that's a mistake. And I challenged her to test it. And so she went out and studied people in various jobs and had them actually fill out a survey on how often they procrastinate. And then their supervisors rated their creativity. And then we ran some experiments together where we tempted people to procrastinate by putting different numbers of funny YouTube videos available while they were supposed to be doing creative tasks. And then we got their creativity scored by experts. And lo and behold, it turned out that people who procrastinate a little bit are more creative than people who precrastinate like me.
What's your conclusion as to why?
Well, we had a few hunches at first that we tested. The first thing I wanted to know is what happened to the people who always procrastinated. And Jihei was like, I don't know, they never filled out my survey.
Yeah.
No, they did eventually fill out the survey, and they were also less creative. So both extremes were bad. If you never procrastinate, if you always procrastinate, you are less creative than if you sometimes do, or if you do a little. And what we found is there are a couple of mechanisms at play. One is that procrastination can lead you to incubate ideas in the back of your mind. So you have time to connect the dots, see patterns you didn't see before. Another is that you end up getting some distance from the problem, and that allows you to reframe it and look at it from a broader perspective. And so what was interesting in the data, though, was that procrastination only boosted creativity if you were intrinsically motivated by the problem. So if you were putting it off because you were bored or you didn't care, then it didn't stay active in the back of your mind. But if you were putting it off because you were stuck and you hadn't figured it out yet, or you were being patient and you wanted to have 10 or 12 more ideas before you decided which one to pursue, then you actually got a creative boost.
So interesting. And I really relate to it because...
Do you?
Yeah, I 100% relate to it.
Are you a moderate procrastinator?
Yes, 100%. 100%. I think this is important to say because I think sometimes people think that I get a lot of messages from people saying, Steve, I'm procrastinating so much. How do you not procrastinate? And I always look at that and say, look, I'm not the guy to tell you how to do that because procrastination in my mind is a bit of a tool. As you said, there's different types of procrastination that I notice myself doing. One of them is when I get stuck on something and I find myself picking up my phone as if I'm a man possessed. I literally, what I'll do is I'll be in the middle of work and then the next thing I'm on Instagram and I'm like, how did that happen? Oh yeah, because the part in this piece of work you got to is psychologically difficult for some reason. I don't feel prepared or whatever. And then the other thing I notice myself procrastinating on is just when I'm thinking through something, I'll end up just walking around the house. I'll end up cleaning, doing the dishes or whatever, and then coming back to the piece of work later. But I would say that I'm definitely a procrastinator.
That's so interesting. And I think, let's be clear. I'm not encouraging people to procrastinate more. That's not the goal here. The goal is just to normalize procrastination and say it's a natural part of the creative process. Everybody does it sometimes. And even though you expect it to be counterproductive, in certain situations, it can actually lead you to better ideas. And I think there's maybe a myth worth busting here. Research led by Fuchsia Sirwa has shown that we don't procrastinate for the reasons we think we do. So a lot of people think I'm being lazy. I'm avoiding effort. What's wrong with me? Why don't I want to work hard? But it turns out it's not hard work that you're avoiding when you procrastinate. It's negative emotions, unpleasant feelings. You are avoiding a set of tasks that makes you feel frustrated, confused, bored, anxious. A lot of procrastination is driven by fear. I don't know if I can do this. I'm not sure if I'm up to the challenge. And so I put it off. And I think one of the best ways to manage that is to ask, what are the tasks that you consistently procrastinate on? What negative emotions are they stirring up? And then how do you change those?
What do you procrastinate on?
I procrastinate a lot on editing, actually, and revising. I love rough drafting. It feels very creative for me. It's fun to figure out, what does the best evidence say? How do I tell the story that brings the evidence to life? And then the process of, tinkering to get each sentence just right, it bores me. And so I put it off. And I had to figure out, how do I make that more interesting in order to stop procrastinating altogether on it.
And how did you do that?
Well, one of the things I did was, one of my goals in my recent writing was to try to get less abstract and more concrete. Mm-hmm. And so what I started doing was I started rewriting paragraphs in the voices of my favorite fiction authors, which was such a fun experiment. So how would Stephen King write this paragraph?
Oh, right. Okay.
How would Maggie Smith, an amazing poet, how would she write these sentences? Mm. And that made it a creative exercise again.
As I was doing my research ahead of this conversation, I was watching your TED Talk. And one of the things that really stood out to me in your TED Talk was where you start talking about internet browsers. I immediately checked which browser I was using, and I was using Google Chrome.
There you go.
But you make the case that people who, you can tell someone's, I guess, creativity, I'm paraphrasing, I'm putting words in your mouth here, by which internet browser they use. And there was a really important message in there for me. So can you tell me about that? Exactly what the findings can tell us.
Yeah, I was sitting at a conference that I'd helped to organize, and this researcher, Michael Hausman, is giving a presentation. He's got data from 50,000 people, and he knows they're filling out a survey, and then he's tracking their job performance. Huge range of jobs, and he knows what web browser they're on. It's one of the automatically collected data points. And he's like, I wonder if there's anything there. And he finds that he can predict your job performance and also your likelihood of staying in your job from which web browser you're using. And this is so weird. And he stood up and he said that I don't know what's going on here, but it turns out that Chrome and Firefox users are on average better performers, and they stick around longer than if you're using Safari or Internet Explorer. And immediately I had a hunch. I'd been studying initiative and proactivity and being an original thinker. And what hit me was Internet Explorer and Safari are the defaults. They came pre-installed on your phone or your computer. in order to get Chrome or Firefox, you had to question the default and say, I wonder if there's a better browser, and take a little bit of initiative. And so I start proposing this, and people are like, great. So if I download a better browser, I'm going to be better at my job. No, it's not about the browser. It's about the resourcefulness to say, you want to be the kind of person who questions the default and asks if there's a better way. And I think what happens is in people's jobs, I've gone on to study this with some colleagues, the kind of person who upgrades their browser is also the kind of person who asks, is there a more creative way to do my job? Can I reinvent the way that we work together? And that ultimately not only makes you better at your job, it also helps you create a job that you want to stay in.
It makes sense. And so on an ongoing basis, I'm only going to hire people who have Mozilla Firefox or Chrome installed in their browser. It should be an interview question.
I don't know if I would go that far.
No, you said it, so I'm going to do it.
I think it's a fun question to say, okay, how did you, let's not limit it to the browser, but talk to me about how you've challenged the status quo in the past.